Well, are you ready for more cathedrals? The answer may be no, but we are moving on to one more Romanesque style, and that is Norman architecture. The Normans were actually Vikings, but this particular group of Vikings chose not just to rape and pillage, but actually to conquer and rule in northwest France, in Sicily, and finally, and most notably, in England, which they invaded in 1066. So let's start with northern France and William the Conqueror's home church, which you see here. I should note right off that the most prominent feature in the photo at the top right, which is those spires at the top of the towers, were a Gothic addition. They are not Romanesque. Stay tuned. So here again, there are features you should recognize. What do you see in the internal picture of the church on the right? Well, there's a groin vaulted ceiling with very specific ribs. Like the Etonian church at Hildesheim and Speyer Cathedral, the cathedral at Caen employs alternate narrow columns and thick compound piers that go all the way to the springing. The springing is the term for the beginning of the upper arches, and it's probably not a term you need to know. These ribs, in turn, divide the ceiling into 6 sections, a sexpartite vault, while the strong composite piers allow the ceiling to reach high enough to provide for unusually large clerestory windows. Here's another slide showing the same features. Note, too, the tripartite organization of the church. The nave is divided into 3 levels, arcade, tribune, and finally clerestory. What makes it a tribune instead of a triforium? Do you remember? This gets very complicated, and it seems to be different in different sites I've checked. But basically, a tribune is an actual place where people could stand or sit. A triforium is either a layer of false windows, stone arches filled with other stones, or a very narrow passageway. I don't think the College Board is going to give both triforium and tribune as a choice for that middle layer. So just try to remember both terms. Note that this triple sectioning is echoed in the towers. Remember what I said in my last lecture about the geometry of Romanesque churches? Here again, you see a crossing square that's the basic unit of organization. So what did all this careful geometry accomplish? It gave a kind of unity to the structure, and it also drew the eye. It drew the eye up the nave to the away from the self toward God, as represented by the Eucharist at the altar, and up to the ceiling to create a focus on heaven. So I sincerely hope you didn't skip the wonderful animated video of the Bayeux tapestry, which records in minute and painstaking detail the Normans' invasion of England in 1066. This is a tapestry, wool embroidered on linen, and it's actually even more important to military historians than it is to art historians. A lot of what we know about medieval warfare actually comes from studying this tapestry. Here you see just a few of the details, which your book highlights as well. William the Conqueror's claim to the throne came through King Edward the Confessor, King of England. In the top panel, we see the hand of God pointing the way toward Westminster Abbey, where Edward was buried. In the Battle of Hastings panels, we see the Norman cavalry cutting down the Anglo-Saxon defenders. I didn't do a full-scale compare sheet for these 2 works, but let's pause for a moment to do a quick comparison. Do you remember the work on top? What is it? It's a detail from the mosaic of Alexander defeating Darius from around 100 BCE. So what's the obvious similarity, aside from them both being battle scenes? What are the major differences? Well, these are both propaganda pieces. They record the victory of a conqueror, and frankly, they're intended to glorify that conqueror. Both are also, for what it's worth, important historical records of an actual event. But even though the Bayeux tapestry is more than 1,000 years older than the Alexander mosaic, I would say that the Greek mosaic shows more modeling, more perspective. The bodies actually have real shape, and they appear to exist in space. That's actually easier to see on the entire mosaic, which I didn't pull up here. Note, too, that Alexander's face is more expressive. Remember, this is Hellenistic, admittedly early Hellenistic art. Like most medieval art, the design of the Bayeux tapestry is highly linear, rather flat, but still, the moving legs and the contorted heads do kind of suggest the influence of Roman and Greek battle scenes. So the Normans brought gifts as well as bloodshed to Britain, most notably a political and administrative structure that would make British government much more centralized and much less chaotic than the areas that would become the modern-day countries of France and Germany. For our purposes, though, their great gift was the Norman architectural style, with splendid churches that soon cropped up all across England. So let's return to our video for a look at these churches, and especially the spectacular Durham Cathedral. You're going to see a brief introduction to the Gothic art that we'll study next. Okay, you've just seen the video segment on this great cathedral, I hope. Note the slightly pointed arches, the ribbed vault with highly exposed ribs, the chevron or arrow patterns on the archivolts or arch moldings and on the piers, the alternating compound and thick round engraved piers, and the tripartite nave with an arcade, a triforium, and large clerestory windows. The nave elevation, remember elevations are vertical cross sections, shows both the interior arches and quadrant arches. This is really an early form of what would later be Gothic flying buttresses. Stay tuned. These replaced groin vaults in the ceiling of the aisles and gave more support to the towering nave. Otherwise, though, we see a fairly standard Romanesque plan with a nave, a transept, and a central crossing square. The long choir is especially typical of Norman Romanesque churches, as is the triple apse, one larger space for the main altar with two side chapels. Why might Norman churches use a different kind of apse? Can you think about what these churches were used for? Well, one answer is England was not on the major pilgrimage routes to Santiago or Rome. These churches didn't really have to handle the same kinds of crowds. Norman churches often housed relics, however, and pilgrims did journey to see them. One of the most famous works of English literature, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, is all about a group of pilgrims journeying to Canterbury to venerate the relics of St. Thomas of Becket, who, by the way, became a saint when he was murdered by a Norman king. Here's an early illuminated manuscript of the Canterbury Tales. Note the oversized pilgrim, the undersized horse, the beautiful decorative letter, the strong use of lime, but also we're beginning to see some modeling. This is moving into Gothic art. Again, we'll talk about that in my next set of lectures. Oops, doesn't seem to want to pull up. Okay, now we move from Romanesque architecture to Romanesque sculpture, and indeed the rebirth of monumental stone sculpture in the West. Here's one last clip from the video. So the first revived stone sculptures show up in what are called historiated or carved capitals. You just saw some of these in the video from the church at Autun. By the way, all capitals were carved, or the Greek capitals. This means that they were carved with narratives or stories. So note the fantastical animals. The griffin is a legendary creature with a body, tail, and back legs of a lion, the head and wings of an eagle, and an eagle's talons as its front feet. Collections of fantastical beasts in sculpture or painting were known as bestiaries, and they featured prominently in Romanesque and also in Gothic art. One contrast between medieval art and the earlier classical and later Renaissance art is the medieval taste for the scary and the grotesque. The world of spirits, demons, and scary beasts was very real to the people of the Middle Ages. By the way, this is going to return in the Romantic era, where, in fact, artists also became, once again, admirers of the art of the Middle Ages. We'll get there. For now, I would just note that, of course, the Greeks had their scary beasts as well. Think of the serpent strangling Laocoon and his sons. So we've already looked at the pilgrimage church of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. These marble slabs once stood in the crypt or burial chamber that was usually placed under the apse. What really struck me about the central raised panel was how much it resembled Buddha sculpture with the mandorla and the hand gesture. The book also notes its similarity to early medieval ivory carving and repoussé metalwork. Do you remember what repoussé is? It's metal punched out to create raised reliefs. Think of Agamemnon's gold mask from Mycenae. We're going to see some examples in Reliquaries in just a minute. So we looked at this portal with its scalloped edges in my last lecture. The prophet, who may be Isaiah or Jeremiah, is carved into the trumeau, which is labeled here. It served as a companion to Christ as the final judge on the tympanum above. Note how popular a theme the Last Judgment is, especially on doors through which pilgrims would enter. Isaiah and Jeremiah were especially significant because their prophecies were seen as prefiguring Christ's appearance. You need to know that term, prefiguration, when Old Testament scenes are popular because they prefigure something about the Christian faith. Note the characteristic shape of the figures. They're tall and thin. That's driven in part simply by the fact that they are long doorposts. You also see sharply delineated draperies that recall illuminated manuscripts. A lot of use of line in medieval art. So unlike the tympanums we've been viewing, this frieze above a portal tells a narrative, the creation and temptation of Adam and Eve, which was another very popular Romanesque theme. Why do you figure? Well, remember, many pilgrims undertook their journeys as an act of repentance, as Eve was a famous sinner who repented of her sin. Notice the architectural features and the flowing drapery. Again, the classical influence tends to be stronger in Italian Romanesque, which is why I actually think it can be quite tricky to tell Italian Romanesque from Italian Renaissance sculpture. So here's the portal diagram from your book and a photo of the full portal at Moissac. As I just mentioned, the Last Judgment was a popular theme for Romanesque pilgrimage churches, where worshipers were everywhere encouraged to contemplate their sins and ultimate fate. Here again, we see the stylized figure, the heavy use of line, the hieratic scale. In other words, Christ is bigger than the other figures. The tilted heads of most of the figures contrast with the stern, unmoving, fully frontal Christ, who looks, I think, somewhat like a Byzantine Christ. Okay, you've already seen a lot of commentary about this work on a podcast and in the video. This is a College Board favorite. By the way, none of my other sources seem to share the Khan Academy historian skepticism about Giselbertus as a sculptor. I just thought I'd note that. So here again, you see the hierarchy of scale. Christ is much larger than the other figures. But what's really fun about this are some of the details. So here is the sensuous Eve. That's a very early nude. The portrayal of souls being weighed with some devilish interference. And I wanted to blow up the devilish scene because I thought it was so great. You see the full weighing of souls segment with those wonderful, scary hands reaching down to pluck a hapless sinner. So this tympanum was featured on the optional podcast. If you're finding these sculptures confusing or overwhelming, you might want to take a look at that one as well. But here we see another popular Romanesque theme, Christ sending the apostles out to the world. So why would that be a popular subject in the 12th century, the 1100s? Remember, that's the century I want you to keep straight. Well, this was the age of the Crusades, when knights rode east to liberate Jerusalem, or at least so they hoped. Notice, by the way, how much more active and dynamic this sculpture is. Christ is actually moving. He has extra large hands gesturing to his followers. This is late Romanesque, and we're moving toward a more animated high medieval style of Gothic art. Again, stay tuned. Here are some of the weirder details from this piece. The artist is depicting unknown people to be evangelized as very weird. So people with dog heads, Siamese twins, a man who may be a pygmy. In other words, in these unknown lands, here be dragons. Note that this is before the age of exploration, but the Crusades do introduce Christians to new parts of the world. While the Romanesque period is most famous for its monumental stone sculpture, wood carving also remained an important art. Here we see Mary as Christ's throne, the throne of wisdom. This is a common iconographic portrayal of Mary. And in some ways, it really does resemble a Byzantine icon. You see the strong use of line, the frontal, impassive, but somehow kind of warm figure. Still, the modeling is softer. Okay, note the date on this piece. This really belonged in your last unit, but I included it here because we're focusing on relics in pilgrimage churches. Some scholars think this was actually a death mask of Charlemagne. At any rate, although the image does not appear in your textbook, it did appear on the AP exam a few years ago. It will show up on this unit's exam for that reason. Santa Foy was a young girl from what is now southern France who died during Diocletian's persecutions of Christians back in the late Roman Empire. The statue is gold and covered with precious stones. By the way, it shows up as one of the figures AP students will need to know starting next year. Now, this image is in your textbook and dates from our period. The work, again, is repoussé, punched out silver with enamel and gems. This is the kind of work, by the way, that made Bernard of Clairvaux and the Cistercians so mad. Much of the mural painting that survives from this period was found in remote corners of far northern Spain. A lot of it was destroyed when these Romanesque churches were rebuilt as Gothic churches. And this was also not far from the region that was conquered by the Muslims. Here, the Byzantine influence is very strong, and some of that actually comes through the Muslims. So what Byzantine elements do you see? Well, there's that long, thin nose, the large almond-shaped eyes, the very frontal view, the Christ Pantocrator symbolism, including the hand blessing the world. Here again, volume is expressed almost entirely with line, although there is a little modeling or depiction of three-dimensional space, using color as well. Manuscript illumination remained an important art form during this period. Here we see an elaborately decorated capital letter in the form of a knight combating a dragon. The depiction of the saint as a knight shows the Romanesque influence. This was the age not only of pilgrimage, but of the great tournaments between knights. By the way, the term for this kind of initial is also historiated, similar to historiated capitals. Basically, both of the terms mean illuminated and historiated mean illustrated. This illuminated manuscript page shows its Romanesque rather than early medieval origin in its softer colors, stronger lines, and the fact that the page actually purports to show the illustrator himself at work. Most artists are still anonymous, view their work as serving God, not as producing art. Still, we're beginning to see a few more artists identifying themselves in a small way. By the way, I think it's very unlikely that the College Board is going to try to get you to distinguish between an early medieval, a Romanesque, and a Gothic illuminated manuscript. The differences are just nowhere nearly as distinctive. Okay, I'm hoping you still have time to close with a discussion of this 2005 essay question. You all recognize the art historical period, right? It's the one we're studying right now. It may be tougher to keep Romanesque straight from Gothic in May, but basically, if you see a carved tympanum above a door, this is going to be a question about Romanesque art, and specifically the Romanesque art of pilgrimage churches. So, what is the relationship between the placement of the tympanum and its iconography? Well, basically, there's not a long rubric for this. The College Board is looking for you to talk about pilgrimage churches, why the Last Judgment would be an important scene, and why it would be in this particular doorway where pilgrims would enter. Let me just note that some variation of this question with this particular tympanum shows up all the time as an essay question or as a multiple choice. In fact, there's another question about it on your oral essay sheet. I don't know how much time you'll have left, but I'm hoping you'll be able to close this discussion of Romanesque art by looking more closely at the church that next year's AP exam uses as the chief example of Romanesque architecture. I don't have it on the slide here, but you do have the 4 images that are on next year's AP image list on your notes template. It would not entirely surprise me if this church showed up on this year's test as well, just to be identified as Romanesque. It's very clearly Romanesque. I don't think you'd need to identify it by name now. Then we'll move on to the splendor of Gothic cathedrals. More vocabulary, but to die for stained glass windows, and you'll get a little break over Thanksgiving. You guys have earned it.